Well, we movie stars get the glory. I guess we have to take the little heartaches that go with it. People think we lead lives of glamour and romance, but we're really lonely. Terribly lonely. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 82 of Movies Are Awesome, the show all about coffee roasting. My name is Nathan Pottle, and thank you so much for joining me today. And before we get into today's topic, the one major thing that kind of happened in the last week was on October 31st, Halloween, we had the passing of Sean Connery. Sir Sean Connery, I should say. Sean Connery, as you may or may not know, he's a very famous actor. He was the original James Bond in Dr. No and a few other James Bond movies as well. He's in The Hunt for Red October. He's in The Rock. He's in a bunch of movies. He's very famous. He's known for the way that he speaks. He has a very specific kind of slurred accent. Sounds like he's kind of drunk all the time, but he's really spectacular. He was 90 years old and he passed away. So on Halloween night, after we found out that he was dead, in honor of Sean Connery's memory, my wife and I sat down and we watched Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which is not only the best of the Indiana Jones movies, it's also the one that he is in. And the reason that it's the best is largely in part because he is in it. And Sean Connery's performance in that movie, and in most movies that he appears in, he's really just fantastic. He hasn't been in a movie in a really long time. He retired from acting a while ago. The last movie that he was in, if I remember correctly, was The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which actually wasn't that good. And I think because that movie was so poorly received was part of why he stepped away from acting, if I remember right. But now he's passed on, so if you have the opportunity, check out a Sean Connery movie, watch it, and just enjoy it. He's so great. Sean Connery is pretty wonderful. Today, though, I am talking about Under the Radar movies. Now, this episode is titled Under the Radar Movies Part 2, because if you've been listening to the show for a long time, way back in episode 8, I did my first episode of Under the Radar movies. So I'm revisiting this topic, talking about more movies that people maybe haven't heard of or maybe haven't seen and don't really know much about and maybe should check out, movies that are worth seeing. So way back in episode 8, that feels like so long ago already. That was 74 episodes ago, which is really a long time ago. It feels like I've been doing this podcast for some time, which I guess I kind of have. I am getting close to 2 years that I've been doing it. Now, I haven't been entirely consistent doing an episode every week. Sometimes I'll skip one, or in the first summer that I was doing the podcast, I skipped over the entire summer and didn't do an episode at all. So I'm not at over 100 episodes, which would make sense if I did one every week for 2 years, but almost 2 years ago was when I started the podcast, and I've really enjoyed doing it, and here I am recycling episodes already. I'm already tapped for material, and here I am recycling stuff. So Under the Radar Movies Part 2 is what I'm talking about today, and I've specifically chosen movies that are a little bit newer. I feel sometimes maybe I talk about classics and movies from the 1900s a whole lot more than I do about more modern movies. So I specifically picked movies that I feel were kind of passed over or just came and went and didn't really have much staying power, you know? And I think that people should check out these movies because I think all 5 of these are really great. I'm going to talk about them in order of release date, obviously starting with oldest first to the newest. And the oldest one that I have here, why don't I just start off with Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? This movie came out in the year 2000, and it's directed by the Coen brothers. If you're not familiar with the Coen brothers, they've done Fargo or The Big Lebowski or No Country for Old Men, and it's kind of a crazy spectrum of the movies that they make. It's either these outlandish comedies or these very serious dramas. And Oh Brother, Where Art Thou kind of falls in the middle somewhere. It's serious and dramatic, but it's also quite funny and entertaining at the same time. It might be my favorite of their movies. I go back and forth between Oh Brother, Where Art Thou and No Country for Old Men. Old Country for Old Men is really, really good. It's not a movie for everybody, though. But Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is a movie that I feel is a lot more accessible to general audiences. There's a couple of musical sequences where they sing songs. It's really, so why don't I just talk about the story? That's probably a good idea. So, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is a story of these three guys who have broken out of prison and they are going on a journey. And George Clooney's character, he wants to be reunited with his wife. And the other two guys, they have stuff going on with them as well. George Clooney is traveling with John Turturro and Tim Blake Nelson, who they might not be actors that you know their names, but as soon as you see them, you're like, oh yeah, I know he's that guy from this movie, or he's that guy from this movie, right? And I find we run into that a lot when it comes to character actors who have very unique personalities and faces, but they're not household names, but we recognize their faces because they appear in so many different movies or TV shows or whatever. And that's the case with John Turturro and Tim Blake Nelson. But all of these performances are really great. John Goodman is in this movie as well. It's just so much fun. I really like looking into the behind the scenes and how this movie was edited and how it was color corrected, because this whole movie is kind of shot in more sepia tones. Everything looks kind of brown. But at the same time, even though everything looks kind of brown, the images are still interesting. It doesn't feel flat and boring as it does with some other movies that are shot this way. It's probably also worth noting as well that O Brother, Where Art Thou is loosely based off of the Odyssey, which was written by, who wrote it? Some ancient Greek guy, or was he Roman, or something? Why do I not remember? I've read it. It's if you haven't read the Odyssey, it's just a big poem. It's an epic poem of this guy who goes on a journey to be reunited with his wife, essentially, is what the Odyssey is. And that's what Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is as well, with some extra characters thrown in there. And it's a really fun movie. It's a hard movie to describe, especially because it hits so many different things. There are some action sequences, there are some musical numbers, there are some really dramatic acting moments, there's a lot of comedy. It's really quite an amalgamation of a bunch of different things rolled into one, and it really works. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is a really great movie. If you haven't had the chance to see it, or even if you've never heard of it, I'd recommend checking it out. Directed by the Coen brothers, released in 2000. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is the first of my under the radar movies that I'm talking about today. My next one, though, we're going from the year 2000 all the way to 2015. This is a movie called Everest. Everest is directed by Baltasar Kormákur, and this director, he hasn't really done much else of note. He directed a movie called Adrift with Shailene Woodley and that other guy, I don't remember his name. And that came out last year, the year before, and it wasn't very good. Adrift is not a very good movie. It's actually one of the very few movies that I left the theater while watching it and just straight up didn't even finish it. I haven't seen the whole thing because it was just so boring and not interesting in any way. Everest is a really good movie. I saw it in IMAX when it first came out, and I actually haven't revisited since then, but it's one of those movies that just has stuck in my mind, and I should revisit it and rewatch it. Even though I haven't seen it in 5 years, I still think about it because it's a movie that just gripped me. It's very edge of your seat. It's about this mountain climber who's from New Zealand, and he takes tourists up Mount Everest, and they climb up to the top and then they climb back down. And that's basically his entire job. And it's the story of him and these tourists climbing Mount Everest during a really big storm, and they get caught in this storm, and it's them trying to survive. And it's a gripping tale. It's terrifying. It makes you feel cold if movies are able to do that. Like, you actually feel what the actors are going through. It's very stress-inducing, and that's just because this movie is so engaging. I've really enjoyed Everest a lot. It has Jason Clarke, who is not super famous, but he's in a lot of really good movies. He's in Everest, he's in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, he's in a movie called Winchester, which I haven't seen, which I heard wasn't very good. So that's not really proving my point, is it? But at least the movies that I've seen him in, he's really good in. He's also in the new Pet Sematary, which I also haven't seen, but I heard that it was good and kind of scary. I just didn't watch it, though, because it seemed like it would freak me right out. I'm not into that kind of stuff at all. Anytime a movie has to deal with like possession or people coming back from the dead, that really, really terrifies me, and I am just freaked right out. To this day, I have not finished watching The Conjuring, because The Conjuring is just the scariest thing I think I've ever seen. I just was so freaked out by it, I could not finish that movie. So to this day, I've not seen the end of The Conjuring, because just that kind of stuff, it really freaks me out. Why am I talking about this though? Jason Clarke in Everest, his performance is really good. There are other good performances in this movie as well, but the performers are not as noteworthy as Jason Clarke, because he's the main character and he's really the only actor that I've ever heard of, like who is more commonly heard of, you know? But anyway, when I saw this movie in IMAX, it was really engaging, really interesting. The shots of the mountain and the heights that they're climbing, really, really stress inducing. If you get vertigo or if you're scared of heights, this movie might not be for you. So know that going into it. But overall, Everest is a really strong film, and it just kind of came and went, and I feel like not a lot of people have seen it. I know one other person who has seen it, and that's my friend who I went to the theater to go watch it with. My wife hasn't even seen this movie. And my wife has seen a lot of movies because of me, but she hasn't seen this one. So I don't know a lot of people who have seen Everest. It didn't really get the recognition that it deserves. So Everest is number 2 on my list of under the radar movies. I'm going to move on to number 3, which also came out in 2015. I feel like this one got a little bit more play than Everest did, just because of the cast and their director. This movie is called The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and it's directed by Guy Ritchie and stars Henry Cavill, Armie Hammer, and Alicia Vikander. Now, when it comes to The Man from U.N.C.L.E., you might be thinking, oh, this movie was pretty big, it had a big theatrical run. Why is this an under-the-radar movie? And that's because this movie didn't make a lot of money. I think Guy Ritchie fans went to go see it, or just movie fans or fans of the original Man from U.N.C.L.E. television series went to go watch this movie, and that's about it. But this movie is charming and stylish and fun. It really felt like a classic Guy Ritchie movie from the 1990s, when he was just at the top of his game and everything that he made was fresh and dynamic and interesting. That's what this movie felt like to me. I liked it a lot. Henry Cavill is wonderful in it. Armie Hammer, Alicia Vikander, they're all great. They're all engaging. They're all interesting. They're dynamic between the interplay that we get between all these 3 main characters is really interesting. And so basically the story is, I should brush up on that. I always forget to talk about the story. How are you going to be interested in a movie if I don't talk about what it's about? Basically, we have a Russian agent and a British agent who have to team up in order to save the world or whatever. And it takes place, I think, a little bit in Berlin, and they have the Berlin Wall, and there's like Cold War stuff going on during this movie. I'm pretty sure that's what it's about. I haven't seen it in a bit, but this movie came to mind when thinking about under the radar movies, so here we are. I should have brushed up on the story, but I didn't. So basically, Henry Cavill and Armie Hammer are enemies, but they have to work together to protect Alicia Vikander's character, who is important for the plot in some respect. I don't 100% remember, but I remember that this movie is just so delightful and charming. We get very classic Guy Ritchie isms throughout this film, which some people are not into. I really like it within the right context. I feel that some of Guy Ritchie's stuff, especially when he plays with shutter speeds and people's movements, look really weird. I think in the remake of Aladdin that he directed, I feel it doesn't work in that. I feel the same about the King Arthur movie that he directed. I did not like that movie at all, but The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Snatch, Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, those movies are all great. Even his Sherlock Holmes movies, I really enjoy. Guy Ritchie is a solid director for the most part, and The Man from U.N.C.L.E., I feel, is a solid movie, and not enough people went to go watch it. So this is my thumbs up endorsement for The Man from U.N.C.L.E. You should check this movie out. It's a lot of fun. It's very 60s. It's very Guy Ritchie. It's very enjoyable on all levels. Most people who I know who have seen it have all said that they really enjoyed it. It's worth watching. So check out The Man from U.N.C.L.E., directed by Guy Ritchie, came out in 2015. I've only got 2 left to talk about, and both of them came out in 2016. So the first one that I want to mention is a movie called Hell or High Water, and this is directed by a guy named David Mackenzie, and I actually took the time to look up what other movies he's made, and I hadn't heard of a single one. So he makes very small movies, and this is kind of the one that broke through and more people heard of and more people saw. This movie did actually get nominated for Best Picture the year that it came out, but I still feel that almost no one has seen it. Basically, the story is Chris Pine and Ben Foster. They play a couple of brothers, and basically, to save their ranch, they start robbing banks and going off on these road trips to get all this money to save their family ranch. And Jeff Bridges plays a sheriff who is hunting them down and trying to figure out where they are and what they're doing and what their plan is. Now, this movie is dramatic and it's serious, but it's so good. It's very riveting and engaging. It feels a lot like No Country for Old Men, if you've seen that one. It feels a lot like that. It's just a little less serious than No Country for Old Men, though. There is time for levity. Chris Pine is the main character of this movie, and he's proved in the past he has very good comedic timing, so he's very funny. In this movie, he's only a little bit funny. This is another one of those movies that I have only seen it once, but it's just stuck in my mind as a really excellent film that didn't quite get the due that it was due. Get the due that it was due? Sure, we'll go with that. Either way, my point is, not enough people have seen this movie, and it's really fantastic, and the plot takes some twists and turns that you may not entirely expect, or twists and turns that may not play out exactly in the way that you're expecting them to. It's a very interesting story. It's very well performed. Chris Pine is fantastic in it. It's probably my favorite performance of his that I've seen. And Jeff Bridges, he's obviously great in everything. I don't think I've seen a single Jeff Bridges movie where he doesn't really perform, like it doesn't really bring it. Even in Tron Legacy, Jeff Bridges is pretty great because he's Jeff Bridges. Speaking of Jeff Bridges, though, he had some kind of, it wasn't cancer, but he was diagnosed with something recently, and they said that he's really hopeful about his recovery, so that's awesome. Can't remember exactly what he was diagnosed with, but it didn't sound good. It started with an L, was it lymphoma? Something like that. This is definitely information that I should have at my fingertips, but I do not. I don't have my phone on me, it's in the other room. I'm not going to go look it up. But hopefully Jeff Bridges is able to make a speedy, healthy recovery. He's a great actor, and I want to see him in more things. And lucky for him, he has access to very expensive doctors and equipment and stuff like that. So he should be just fine. Hopefully, 2020 has taken enough from us. Not Jeff Bridges. He's going to be just fine, I'm pretty sure. And Hell or High Water is a great movie that features Jeff Bridges and Chris Pine, and it came out in 2016, and I highly recommend checking it out if you're wanting to see a Western type No Country for Old Men but slightly different movie. Then this is what you're looking for. Granted, this movie's not for everybody. It is violent. There's a little bit of adult stuff going on in this movie, not too much, but overall it's really solid. Hell or High Water, check it out. I've only got one movie left, and I'll talk about it in a second, but before I talk about my last movie, I want to mention that when I was originally making an Under the Radar Movies Part 2 list, like over a year ago, I was working on this and had it as an idea for another podcast episode that I could do one day when I didn't really have a topic to talk about. What I had initially on that list were two movies that were The Hunt for the Wilder People and What We Do in the Shadows. Now, these movies are directed by Taika Waititi, and this is before Taika Waititi did Jojo Rabbit and just before Thor Ragnarok came out. So those were movies that people really hadn't heard of, but now Taika Waititi is super, super famous, so I figured there's no point in bringing up these movies that he directed a while ago, because now that people know who he is as a director, they're going to go through his backlog of movies and check these ones out. Hunt for the Wilder People is probably my favorite of Taika Waititi's movies. Jojo Rabbit is also excellent. but there's just something about Hunt for the Wilder People that I really, really like. And What We Do in the Shadows is a really funny movie about modern day vampires, and it's like a mockumentary of sorts. So those movies were going to be initially on my list. They're not anymore. The last one I'm going to talk about, though, is a movie from 2016. It is directed by J.A. Bayona, and it is called A Monster Calls. And A Monster Calls is kind of a dour, sad movie. It's about a little boy whose mom's dying of cancer, and how he's coping with that is basically he's staying with his grandmother, who's played by Sigourney Weaver, and she is surprisingly good in this movie. Like, she really is excellent in the film. But this little boy, there's this big gnarled tree that comes to life, and it's this tree monster who helps the little boy, and they work together to get through his mom's cancer and having to deal with all of that. So the movie is very serious. The mom is played by Felicity Jones, who's dying of cancer. She has an excellent performance in this movie. The tree monster is voiced by Liam Neeson, and oh my goodness, his voice acting, obviously he's done it before in The Chronicles of Narnia when he played Aslan, but in this one he really nails this tree monster and all of the emotion and that everything that this little boy is dealing with really knocks it out of the park. This is a really well-made film. It came and went. When this movie came out into theaters, the closest theater that it came to was like a 35-minute drive for me and my wife. Right now, the closest theater to my house is 3 minutes away. But we had to go 35 minutes to the only theater that was playing this movie so that we could watch it. And there was only one other person in the auditorium with us. Nobody went to go see this movie. Nobody heard of it. It made no money, and it got zero recognition. And it's really fantastic. J.A. Bayona really knocked it out of the park with this movie. He then later went on to direct Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, which is really awful. So I'm sad about that. But A Monster Calls is just a gut punch, heart-wrenching film about this poor little boy dealing with the emotions of living with his grandmother and his deadbeat dad and his mother who's dying of cancer. And all of these things are kind of overwhelming to him, and everything that he has to deal with. Then at school, there's just so much depth to this movie, and the visual effects of the tree monster I find really work. It is based off of a book. I think it's like a picture book for kids. I don't remember exactly though, because I haven't read it, but I remember seeing it in stores. So is it a chapter book or is it a picture book? I don't know. It's one of the two, but you should watch the movie because the movie is magnificent. I think that's pretty much all I have to say about A Monster Calls though, which brings me to the end of my list. Why don't I run through them one more time just so you guys can remember. We've got Oh Brother, Where Art Thou from the year 2000, Everest from 2015, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. also from 2015, Hell or High Water from 2016, and lastly, A Monster Calls, also from 2016. So that's going to be it for Under the Radar Movies Part 2. Please feel free to go back to Episode 8 and check out Under the Radar Movies Part 1. I don't know how well refined my recording was back then. It's probably not as good as it is today, but that's totally fine. The list still stands. It's a good list of movies if I remember correctly. But what I'm wanting to ask you guys today is, what is your favorite Under the Radar movie, or have you seen any of these? Do you enjoy them? Please feel free to let me know. You can reach out to me on social media. You can find me on Twitter at Pottle Nathan, and the show is on Instagram at Movies Are Awesome Podcast. You can also email the show at moviesareawesomepod@gmail.com. If you haven't done so, please feel free to subscribe to the show. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and a whole bunch of other places. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Really means a lot to me. I've got a review lined up for next week, so that'll be fun. So stay tuned for that one. And as always, if you have nothing else to do, go watch more movies.